on. We reached maximum participation on this platform, which is so exciting. But that also means that a lot of people who wanted to register weren't able to. So if those were people in your office or people that you know, please let them know that we will have a recording of this available in about 48 hours. And we'll make sure that everyone who isn't able to sign up gets that. So please contact one of us, or you can email the webinar invite directly and it will go to us at Public Works and we can make sure that you get that recording. Just a few logistics. My name's Anika, I'm with Public Works, and if you haven't used Fuse before, it's pretty awesome because you get to see us. And if you have a question, you can also make sure that you are visible to us as well through your camera, but otherwise everyone is muted and everyone's camera is off by default. Oh, why is this happening? Okay, let's move. And so that's a pretty cool tool, so we're excited about that. But again, since there's so many of us, all of you will be on default without any microphone or camera unless you do want to show yourself during the question and answer period. If you have a question to ask during the webinar, you can use the chat function, which I believe is going to be in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can chat it to all the presenters, to a presenter specifically, or to Public Works if it's a logistical question. If you aren't able to hear us or have your any other troubles, please use the chat window for that function. I think that is all of the logistical things we've got. You can log on via your computer and hear sound, or you can do it on your telephone. All right.
So Anika, we have a few people who've raised concerns in the chat about audio access and such, and so I would just ask, like Sarah in our office, who I know is helping you there with logistics, to try and message one-on-one with those folks who are raising concerns about not being able to hear or something. So.
Yes, thank you, Elaine, for messaging that. We are getting some people saying that they cannot hear it, and it looks like Sarah is taking care of that on the back end with the phone number and the ID in the chat box. So yeah, please continue to chat, and our Director of Operations will make sure that you can hear. Thank you, Elaine. So exciting. So again, like I said, my name is Anika Fassia, and I'm the Director of Outreach at Public Works, and I'm joined by my colleague, Elaine Mejia. Elaine, do you want to wave your hand?
Hey, folks.
And we're joined by our national partner, the Center for Social Inclusion, with Jessica Kong. You want to wave your hand, Jessica? And we have Rich from the Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, and Bill Kopsky, I'm sorry if I said that last name wrong, with the Arkansas Public Policy Panel. Bill, would you like to wave?
Got it just right, actually.
Okay, perfect. All right. So at Public Works, our mission has been for over a decade now to really ignite and seek aspiration and action for a government that works on behalf of everyone. And many of you have been partners with us for a really long time, have been to our trainings, and helped us refine our work and show what that work looks like on the ground, and we are forever grateful. And we've had the opportunity to work with national partners like the Center for Social Inclusion to take this research onto the ground and into the field and see how it works in your communities to make your communities better, to make the case for public solutions, and to get the investments that we need in our public systems. So just a brief overview of what that research has looked like over the years. We sponsored a round of research that really looked into how the American public looks into the role or views the role of government in society, the role of government's role in the economy, and the role of taxes and budget. And through this work, like I said, we've worked with folks like Rich and Bill on the ground with this curriculum and had this feedback loop where they work on it on the ground and then tell us how is that working, how can we refine it, and continue to make an evolving narrative of why we need these public systems to work on behalf of all of us. And over the years, we've been really intentional to think about how this intersection of race and government plays out in these conversations, and how implicit bias, explicit bias, a lot of the ways that people in power are using this language has undermined support for our public systems. And I'll just pause for a moment so you can read the quote on the slide, which we believe is really symbolic to what this intersection means and how it's been playing out. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that there isn't a magic potion or solution to how we navigate these conversations around race and government and the role that it has in our lives. But we are navigating this intersection and this challenge together. And we're really excited to hear how folks like Rich and Bill on the ground are navigating these waters and how we can use that information and this shared knowledge to move forward together. So again, thank you so much to my co-presenters for sharing your stories today. I'm going to hand it over to Jessica in a minute, but I want to end this portion by just saying that, you know, we see at Public Works government as a tool, and it has been used in both ways to further justice, and it has also been used in a lot of ways to exacerbate injustice in communities. And so I think the fundamental question is how are we using this tool to reclaim it, to revitalize it for the common good, acknowledging that we are actors in using this tool, and what is that role that we have in reclaiming that. All right, Jessica, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Anika and Elaine for welcoming us all into this space. I'm really excited to be here. As Anika mentioned, my name is Jessica. I work for the Center for Social Inclusion. I'm the senior research scientist here, and I've been here for about 3 years, working on research about communicating on race, primarily regarding the question of how can we move people to endorse more progressive policies. We just released our brand new report in August, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, just a brief snapshot of our methods and research and some strategies that we've developed from that. Let me go forward. So just before I go over the research, just go over CSI real quick, because I know some folks are not familiar with CSI. So CSI is a 13-year-old organization. It's a national policy and communication strategy organization working to transform structural barriers to opportunity for communities of color and ensure that we all share in the benefits and burdens of public policy. So we do this work in 3 ways. We lift up the ideas of communities of color on the ground. We highlight critical leadership from groups that are pushing for racial equity, and we research ways that we can communicate about race effectively. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned before, we just released our newest report about our communications research. It includes our results for the past 4 years. It's a labor of love. We've created and tested a set of messages in focus groups in California and Michigan, and completed 2 different national surveys in 2012 and 2014. So I'm just going to go over those 2 national surveys real quickly. There we go. All right, so for each round of testing, we chose policy issues to test based on what was being debated in the national space at the time. In 2012, which is this slide, it was healthcare and finance reform, more specifically subprime lending, so it's housing reform. So right before 2012, we began cultivating a set of messages that we shorthandedly called our progressive and conservative messages. Progressive messages had images and words that evoked values of reinvestment in government and varying levels of racial explicitness. For lack of a better word, we call them progressive values. And conservative message had images and words that evoke values of protecting businesses and putting the blame on the takers, and there's no mentioning of race at all. So these messages were presented to participants or surveyors in a short 1-minute video in a commercial format. And we pitted the progressive message with the conservative message by having all participants see the conservative message and then a version of our progressive message. So we really want to see if, despite the effects of the conservative message, if people would still agree with the progressive message and move towards policy reform. So our objective was to see if we could get people who saw our progressive message to agree more with the message and to vote for healthcare and finance reform. And we surveyed 900 registered voters across the United States with the help of a consultant firm, Weston Strategies. So we found in our 2012 testing that when we asked respondents how much they agreed with the different messages, note the top 3 ones are the progressive ones, they mentioned race, and on a scale of 0 to completely disagree to 100 completely agree, participants overall agreed most with progressive messages, and in fact, mostly with the explicit race message. So in other words, when participants saw a message talking explicitly about race and has a more racially diverse cast, participants agreed more with this message than a conservative message. And this is really great news, but it of course is not much surprising now as we see more TV shows and media about a more diverse cast. So notably, we do not see folks differ in their endorsement of policy reform. So there wasn't a significant difference whether or not they saw the progressive message or just a conservative message and how they actually endorse housing policy reform and healthcare. So we decided to further revise our messaging and run some focus groups and test again in 2014. So similar to the 2012 messaging, we tested progressive messages against conservative messages varying in racial explicitness. We surveyed over 1,700 registered voters across the nation. And slightly different from before, we tested implicit bias before and after participants saw our messages. And because we've heard a lot of pushback from folks that perhaps we're spiking implicit bias, that's why we tested it specifically to see if it does spike up implicit bias. And this time we focused on fiscal policies because fiscal policies are very relevant for our community partners and the coalitions that we were working with. So there's a lot of wording on this, but we found a variety of results. The main takeaway is that people who saw our progressive messages endorsed more progressive policies. So participants who saw progressive messages over just the conservative message were saying, yes, we need to have tax reform and we need more government involvement in services and spending, which is great. But this is a really big finding, but we also found some complexity in that. So one of them is that the majority of people were holding 2 frames at once. So they were agreeing with the progressive message, but they were also agreeing with our conservative messaging. And also, people with high implicit bias when watching a progressive, racially explicit message still agreed with progressive fiscal policies. This is great news because we had a fear that we could be spiking up people's implicit bias, but people were not spiking implicit bias. And in fact, even people with high implicit bias were agreeing more with progressive fiscal policies. And finally, that multiracial spokespeople having that diverse cast is better received overall by participants than a white-only cast. So together, these results have a very positive picture, and it's also very complicated. So we really developed through these different types of testing, focus grouping, and surveying nationally, a model for how we can really effectively talk about race that we call the ACT model. Let's go to my notes. Okay, so we've developed a model that captures the way that we have cultivated our own successful messages. We call it the ACT model, which stands for affirm, counter, and transform. And under these 3 categories, we have 6 strategies that we suggest folks use in their own messaging on race. So first off, we affirmed our audiences. We told them a story that gets at values and emotions to engage our audience. We mentioned words like hardworking American. We were all affected by the recession. We made sure to explain like why we're all in this together, that everyone is impacted, that we have a shared fate. Secondly, we countered. So we explained how we got here. We give them a very, very, very brief and watered down version of structural racism 101. Like this is the history of, the policies, the specific issue that you're working on. And most importantly, we talked about race directly. So we said words like, this is not about immigrants. This is not about people taking from society. This is about, all the troubles that we've been all impacted by. And finally, we begin changing people's attitudes by reframing to who the makers and takers are. And we say, we switch between makers and takers and winners and losers. But in our case, we said makers and takers in our society. In our case, it was hardworking people of color, and takers are the corporations who are fighting for tax loopholes. And we always end finally with the heart and solution. So folks really like action items and they really like stories. So feeling like they are moving towards a positive change is a really effective way to push people towards a specific action. So we based our messaging off of this framework, and we've also, for reference, created a toolkit that's available on our website that people can walk through these strategies and apply on their own issues and their own messaging. So that was a really brief, like way faster than I imagined, and whirlwind explanation. But for more information, please do not hesitate to send an email to CSI, the info box, or me. There's a full report and toolkit that's available also on the website, as I mentioned before, under the communications tab. And then I will turn it to Bill or Rich for the next part.
Actually, before you move to Rich, Jessica, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you give any examples of what a progressive versus a conservative frame might be, and also give some examples of how you what different degrees of explicitness about race meant through the lens of one specific question? That was a little conceptual, and it'd be good for it'd help me to see it concretely through an example, if that's fair to ask you.
Yeah. It's hard to just like talk about it without like showing you specifically. And there's like specific example, like we have all our messages in the report. But one key example of the difference between the conservative and progressive is this emphasis on like who are the who's like taking from society. So we have like pictures of like people of color standing in like food stamp lines in the conservative messaging and being like, there are people who are taking and are just receiving handouts while people are suffering. And then for the progressive one, it's like we have people of color in different kinds of jobs being like, I make like construction work and I make homes that are safe for everyone. And there's like teachers of color being like, I teach our children and I contribute to society this way. So that's like a major difference in framing like who actually is like makers and takers and the winners and losers of our society. And the second question was, racial explicitness. So yeah, it just varied in terms of the diversity of the cast. So the people represented in the messaging, and also actual words that we use. So for conservative messages, like there was no mention of race at all. And on varying levels, our progressive message had explicitly talking about race, saying this is not about race, this is not about whether you're Black or white, Latino or Asian, that kind of language to specifically mention and call out that race.
Okay, so hi folks, this is Elaine Mejia with Public Works. I got a little chat here from Anika saying that she's having trouble with her video feed, so I'll step in and just facilitate our conversation, keep us moving along. I'm happy to do that. So thank you, Jessica. I'm sure we will probably have some more questions for you, and I appreciate you being so brief, but I know that means all of the various richness of the report and the toolkit and all the examples and such you didn't get to share, but again, this was giving people a snapshot of what you found, and certainly by way of encouraging them to then look at the full report, because it's such a new fantastic resource that can help move the wisdom in this field forward so much. So thank you. And when we send out resources to folks after this, we will certainly be pointing them towards the full report and the other resources available through CSI. So we'll get back to you when we got some more questions, but thank you so much for that. I think we'll turn now to Rich Hudson with Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. We invited Rich and Bill for a couple of different reasons. I will say, Arkansas is a place where Public Works and CSI have been working with on-the-ground partners in recent years. Arkansas is also a place where Public Works has some research on the ground through Rich and his team there, looking at how Arkansans are thinking about the role of government. How do we talk to them about public solutions? And so glad that you're participating in that. But also, I know, Rich, and we have observed that Arkansas advocates have been putting themselves out there, particularly in the last year or two, in a more explicit, or we'll say racially explicit way, to use Jessica's terms, about racial disparities and the impacts of public solutions on different types of Arkansans. And we thought some of the examples that you have were so great. So we just thought we'd ask you to be here to say on the ground, as your organization is undertaking that and being more public in that space, as a number of groups inside the sort of Kids Count and network are, just to share some of your thoughts on how that's going and what you're learning.
Sure.
So welcome, Rick.
Thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm Rich Huddlestone, the Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. We've been around since 1977. And our mission, which is on the slide there, is to ensure that all children and families have the resources and opportunities they need to lead healthy and productive lives. So racial equity, racial disparities has always been an important part of our work. But I think it's fair to say that over the past probably 2 years in particular, we've placed a much greater focus in both our research and our strategic communications on more explicitly documenting and discussing racial equity and disparities, especially in resources and outcomes for minority children and families across a range of issues. We've done this for a number of reasons. One, the political environment has changed. Our state has definitely gone red the last 3 years. I think we were probably the last state in the South for this to really happen. And so we now have a Republican governor, Republican supermajorities in the legislature, Republican attorney general, and a Supreme Court that probably leans Republican, and very conservatively so. The legislature itself is now very white, very conservative, with strong anti-tax and anti-government views. And we do not have a shortage of legislators who are very vocal and active in issuing public statements and introducing legislation that's clearly anti-poor and in many cases just outright racist. And quite frankly, many just don't care about the concept of racial equity. Unfortunately, at the same time, many in the state, including some of our long-term partners who do a lot of work up at the state capitol and at the legislature, are very reluctant to talk about racial disparities because, quite frankly, they're scared of getting marginalized up at the Capitol, which is now very conservative. And at the same time, as an organization, we've made a conscious effort to have a more diverse staff. And quite frankly, this has really impacted our work, I think, in a really positive way. We have a fellow on staff, Bailey Perkins, who has really pushed us to really address the issue of racial disparity much more directly. And I think at the same time, there are now strategic opportunities at the national level with all the discussion about, police violence in minority communities. I think there's now strategic opportunities that have been created that maybe did not exist several years ago. And so at Arkansas Advocates, we've really tried to do a lot more in this area. And so, I just went back and looked over the past year, and I think we have 12 or 13 pieces, either blog pieces or reports, that have really taken on some issue head on. You have a slide in front of you that just has a sampling of it. But we've done work around educational outcomes and opportunities, school disciplinary practices, child poverty and child well-being, letter grades for Arkansas public schools, how schools are misusing their state poverty funds, not on the populations, which is mainly minority for which it's intended, and health access for immigrant populations. We this year, for the first time, issued a report that I'm actually pretty proud of that our fellow did, and it's a report on race. I lost the slide. Okay, but it's a report on how the legislature missed the mark in terms of race equity during the last legislative session, and really looked at what passed, what didn't, and what the impact on race equity is. And that was really kind of the first time that we've ever done that. I mean, we always do an end of session wrap up type of report in terms of the impact on kids generally, but this was really the first time that explicitly we issued a standalone report really looking at how race equity was impacted during the session. And next year, for the first time, we're going to be doing a state of black males and black boys report. I think our general message along in this work has really been that for the state to grow and prosper economically, we cannot continue to basically write off large segments of our population. whether it's in education or in healthcare, and how kids are treated in the schools. And while I think some of our research in communications has not received the coverage that we would have liked, I think we've actually received pretty good coverage on social media. And I think, if you look at platforms like Twitter and Facebook, both from our organization's accounts, but also from the accounts of our staff, have actually received pretty good coverage of that racial equity work. Of course, there's always that possibility that that we're just talking to our friends who are already predisposed to kind of share similar views. But our view of it is that even if it's true, even if we can just get more of our friends, talking about the issue and getting them engaged on the issue, it will have been an effort well spent. Could have an impact on advocacy. Now we're admittedly we're novices in terms of how to communicate around racial equity in this work. So we're still really learning, how to more effectively to do that. But so we're trying to use resources from Public Works, CSI, the Opportunity Agenda to really help inform our work about how we communicate around these issues using a racial equity lens. I think just to wrap up, I think one of the big lessons that I would point out is that while we need to be as strategic as possible in how we communicate around race equity issues, at some level you just have to really address the issue head on. And I think you can spend too much time, trying to develop a frame that you think is going to reach everybody out there. And quite frankly, that's just not going to happen. Just in our legislature alone, I know that there's 25% of the legislature who, quite frankly, no matter how you frame the issue, you're never going to bring them around. Well, and so you can't let one subgroup of the population out there, even if it's an important audience, really dictate and hold your communications work in race equity hostage. I think you just have to try and develop a plan and messages that you think will work for the most people possible. But you're never going to develop a communication strategy that's going to reach some of those folks. So with that, I will turn any remaining minutes I have over to the master communicator, Bill Kopsky, with the Public Policy Panel, who is one of our key partners and is not one of the partners that has shied away from this work and talking about this issue. So
I don't want to pick up just really quickly before you go to Bill, pick up on one thing you said, Rich, and connect it back to Jessica's from the new resource from CSI, which is hopefully one new piece that will come out of that work from CSI that can help you even further encourage others who you're working with right now to put themselves out there more publicly in this space, is the fact that their research did find that it was actually pretty effective. There are effective ways to actually be sort of explicit about racial inequities and the impacts of public solutions. And this hopefully will give you yet another resource, a piece of encouragement to use with groups that you're working with there. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's a great resource, and we're still just figuring out really how to use it. And I think you're right, though. There are definitely ways that you can talk about this issue in a way that's much more effective than what you're currently doing. So I would encourage all the organizations and folks on this call to check out that resource, because I know it's really a great resource.
So very good. So that was good. So yeah, let's definitely turn it to Bill. Bill, from where I sit, you just unmuted yourself. Welcome, Bill. Thank you for being here. We know that you have been working closely with Jessica and the Center for Social Inclusion and with Rich and others there, trying to have these kind of tough conversations in communities. And hi, is that Bernadette? Hey, welcome. So glad you could be with us. So welcome. We welcome your sort of on the ground wisdom there with what you've been trying out. And whenever you're ready to, I know we have a brief video that we're going to show from you also in the course of your speaking. Let us know when you're ready to roll that video, and we'll give it a shot. Obviously, I've caught our work on Public Works end from this webinar. We're having a little technical difficulties by way of the fact that we've still trouble getting back our other facilitator. But I think we should be able to load and run the video when you're ready, Bill and Bernadette. So welcome. Take the floor, please.
I think that we can do that at the end if there's time. That's probably not the most critical thing. Bernadette is our organizing director and happened to be in the office for another meeting, so I pulled her in because I think her voice is and experience is really helpful to the conversation. So I'll start with a little bit. So the Public Policy Panel, we were founded in 1963 by moms working on school desegregation. And we're multiracial, multicultural from the very beginning. And there's a lot of history there I can share, but that I don't need to. It's a lot of it's on our website if you're curious about it. It's a rich and wonderful history. But really, where we are now is a community organizing group that feels like the biggest precondition to working on racial equity policy or any other policy is having the people who are affected by those policies engaged in helping shape the debate and find the solutions. And so we've really focused a lot initially on just building constituency in marginalized communities, especially in communities of color, African American communities, Latino communities, and low-income white areas. And what we found, frankly, the bottom line takeaway from our work is that it is really hard to talk about explicitly about race, even in just African American communities or just Latino communities or just white communities. And there's a lot of reasons why. And so I thought I would talk about some of the challenges that we've had about what's been hard about it and give you a few maybe stories or examples, and maybe that would enrich the conversation some. And I'll say that we've been a civil rights organization since the 60s, and one of the challenges that we've had in moving civil rights policy is having a organized base of people of color willing to share their stories about their experiences. And without those stories, it's really it looks like great policy groups like Advocates for Children and Families and great liberal do-gooders or whatever trying to do something, but without having really the affected communities organized, engaged, and sharing their stories, it's been hard to move policy. And so an example of that is several years ago, we had our coalition elects our agenda that we carry to the legislature each year, and they elected onto our platform a priority of creating a division of civil rights within the Department of Education. To mediate disputes between parents and children in schools, and also to educate school districts on what their federal civil rights laws are. Arkansas civil rights laws are so weak they're not worthy of talking about, but the federal ones are. And our bill failed in the Senate Education Committee when a white, fairly liberal Democrat senator said, well, we don't need this division of civil rights because we solved all the civil rights problems in the 1970s. There's nothing more we need to do, which is, stunning for someone from my perspective to hear. But the bottom line is that we didn't have a line of 20 African-American parents lined up at the end of the table to tell their stories about what has happened in their schools to dispute that. And without that kind of power and without those stories, you can't move policy, especially in the kind of climate that Rich was describing. On the other hand, I think what a lot of the data shows, though, is that if you can put together those stories and match it with data, I do think there are opportunities to move racial equity policy forward directly. But with the lack of those stories, our strategy for a long time has been to sort of move sideways around racial equity. So working on educational achievement, the achievement gap, and opportunity to learn issues, or working on prison reform, or working on economic justice, but with coming at race from a sideways perspective instead of head on, because we didn't have that base. We've spent a lot of time in the past couple of years trying to figure out how to take that to the next level and start talking about it much more explicitly, and developing an analysis about what the barriers to talking about it more explicitly are. And so a few of those are that, for one, there's really big challenges with the language around race equity and around the framing around race equity. And I'll give you an example. In 2010, we did a survey of about 550 African American parents in South Arkansas. And one of the questions on the survey that I expected a different outcome to was, are civil rights a problem in your school? And, I was expecting 80–90% of the African-American parents to say yes. And instead, nearly 80% said no, civil rights are not a problem in our school. And I was shocked. But later on in the same survey was an open-ended question where people could have put anything. They could put green jello or school buses or poor textbooks, whatever. But the question was, what is the single biggest challenge that your kid faces in school? And again, nearly 80% of parents said some version of my kid's teacher discriminates against him or her because of the color of their skin. And so, in the two numbers, at first you don't think jive because they just said civil rights aren't a problem, and now they're saying that discrimination based on race is the single biggest problem. But it took me a while to understand that, but we really dug into it with some of our leaders and our staff, and the word civil rights means different things. It just doesn't really stick. And for a lot of our parents, they viewed it as really individualized. Like they knew that their teacher was racist to their kid, but they didn't see it as a systems or a policy problem, and they didn't see it as this broader civil rights problem. And so that makes it really hard to talk about when we're speaking in totally different languages to one another, right? And with different frameworks. And so that was a big part of the challenge. Another part of the challenge to us is that there's really big differences in perception. So, and again, another survey in Prescott just this past year, we did a survey of about 200 white and black families. And again, nearly this time we asked the question differently. We said, are race relations a problem in your community? Which some of our leaders have told us to be a better way of asking the question. And nearly 80% of the African Americans who responded to the survey said, yes, race relations are one of the biggest problems in our community. We have to deal with them. Only 20% of the white community said that race relations are a problem. And this is echoed across all kinds of polling. The University of Arkansas Little Rock has done a lot of work on with similar polling, and African Americans, repeatedly again and again say race is still a problem, and white folks again and again either say it's not a problem, or a lot of times even ones that do know that it's a problem are lack the tools to do anything about it, and lack the language and lack the cultural awareness and really the constituency base and partners to do anything about it. So you have some well-intentioned white folks who get that race is a problem, but either try to resolve it in inappropriate ways or just ineffective ways because they lack the tools. And so we focused a lot of our work on trying to develop a base of African American leaders who can share their stories, who we can build a common analysis with, and really using that as a foundation on which to build a campaign and then reach out to white allies and others who are critical of success. But in that area, again, we ran into a lot of challenges. In a lot of communities where we work, the racial equity problems are far worse than most people would acknowledge. We have had a mayor whose life was threatened, first African-American mayor in that community. Another African-American mayor in Arkansas just a few years ago was publicly beaten by opponents from the city council, and the police did nearly nothing. We've had widespread election abuses. The problems go on and on and on and on. And one of the challenges to addressing that is that our leaders are not comfortable talking about those problems and those stories, a lot of times even with each other. And part of the challenge around that is that in a lot of these communities, there are 3 or 4 employers and there's one school district. And so one of our leaders just this summer told us, look, I will do anything to ask me anything to do, and I will do anything to move this campaign forward, but I will not put my grandson in danger at the school. In another school in Arkansas this past year, we had an African-American student beaten up by a white kid, and the white kid was beating him up because the African-American kid was dating the white kid's sister. And the African-American kid who got beaten up was suspended. The white kid who did the beating got a detention. The African-American grandparent of the student, who is one of our leaders, held a meeting with the school superintendent, the principal, and the parents of the white kids. And the the white parents just said point blank, we believe interracial marriage is immoral, and we don't have a problem with what our kids did. And they pulled their kids out, and put them in a private school. And so that sort of stuff happening, and I think our African American leaders are afraid in a lot of cases to share those stories, but they also are really frustrated and resentful. I think the white folks are in denial that those problems are happening, and so trying to sort of juggle all that stuff is difficult. And again, I'll give you one more example, and then I'm going to let Bernadette talk about from some of how all this kind of plays out on the ground through the organizing. But the another of our leaders casually mentioned to us a couple, maybe 2 years ago, that some riders in the night visited them. And we were like, well, what's a rider in the night? And to him, he mentioned it casually, like sort of offhand, no big deal. And what a rider in the night is one of the prominent white business people in the community coming to your house at 10 o'clock at night and starting and having a quote unquote friendly chat about how's your family doing? How are all the relatives that work for me doing? How are your kids in the school doing? And by the way, this work you're doing with your community group, you don't really need to do that. Just come down to my office and we can resolve this on Monday just between us as men. And that stuff is happening. And for a lot of our leaders, we were shocked by it and appalled by it. Our leader, this was standard operating procedure to him. It wasn't that big of a deal. And so, again, developing kind of an analysis about how all that is playing into a systemized a way of oppressing racial opportunities or opportunities for people of different ethnic backgrounds is a big part of the strategy. And then again, kind of creating the environment so that leaders can share their stories, feel comfortable sharing their stories, and then build a common analysis about it is a lot of where the campaign, from our perspective, is anchored. And Bernadette, I know you're actually trying to get our leaders to do all this, and some days they're easier than others. Do you want to share a little bit?
Yes, I believe it came to work here at the panel in 2002, I believe it was. And we initially started by going into the community and trying to do community development type projects and initiatives, because we were thinking, hey, if you fix your, develop a community garden or do a neighborhood watch program or any of those type of things, then that was going to really help that community, those citizens take some ownership in their community and try to improve it. Well, the more we worked in the communities, we found out that it was a whole lot deeper than that. The problems were just not the fact that, hey, we can come in with a program and change things. We have systemic problems in those communities that have been there for years and years and years. And one of the things that has happened is that a lot of our community folk have become desensitized to racial justice and racial equalities. They are very desensitized, not by their own doing, I should say. I think it's because the system has been in place for a long, long time. The status quo in those communities have worked very hard to make sure that they are the ones that are controlling the political system. They are the ones controlling the social what happens in those communities, and more importantly, they are the ones controlling the economics in those communities. And they have considered African Americans and other minorities as someone that were beneath them, and they made sure that they kept them beneath them. And our communities, our members or the people that we work with, they for over the years they have just become used to the fact that, hey, I don't need to go vote, or I don't need to go.
Well, they had to become used to that to survive there, right?
That's right. The status quo and we. I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but the white privilege have really make them understand that, hey, we're in control here and you do what we say, or we're going to take your house and we're going to burn your house down, or we're going to make it hard for your child, or you're going to lose your job, or any number of things that they have within their power to do to this family or to this particular community. So as Bill said, a lot of them just accepted that and went on and did whatever they needed to do to make sure that their families were taken care of. They did not realize that they had a voice or that they could speak up and say, hey, this is wrong, or my child is being mistreated in the school. This is, that they could actually stand up and say something. And when they did, they actually did it as individuals. And, depending on whether you were the principal or the superintendent's friend or someone that they can come and talk to, depends on that, that would ultimately depend what would happen to that particular parent or child. So they really just sat back and accepted it. They just go, well, that's the way it was. When I initially moved here, because I'm not from Arkansas, I'm from Virginia, and I just couldn't believe that folk would just sit back and take this. And I went down, I'm ready to march. Let's go marching. And these people said, no, we're not going to do that. And they refused to do it. So the panel really then went back to the table and said, okay, now what do we need to do to try to encourage, show people, explain to people that they have a voice, that they can stand up, and that they can make a difference. And, it literally that we had to go back to the basics, not just to go in and help them with a community garden, but we had to really begin to build a base of people that will be willing to come to the table and have the discussion, and then begin a leader development process with them that, a lot of times you would think that we could start at a level of bringing folks shared vision and the strategic plan and all of that. Had to actually explain and show them how this worked and why this is important. And it took us a long, long time to get enough of our leaders of the community folks to come to the table and begin looking at this a from a structural structural what is structural racism, perspective.
I I appreciate that. I think the work that you all are doing is helping people see how many steps there are. That this is, of course, part of what we're talking about here today is the communications challenge, but it's much bigger and deeper than that. I think one connection I feel between what you're saying, Bernadette, and the research we've been commissioning at Public Works recently that we have underway is with our research, particularly talking with African Americans, we're finding a heightened sense of awareness of the importance of the role of government in public solutions, but also a much deeper sense of disappointment as well about the failures and the way a government can and has been used as a tool for injustice. In the interest of getting to some question and answer time, which we were really hoping to get today, I do feel like we want to encourage folks to reach out to you all directly to learn more about this community-based approach and fantastic work that you're undertaking. Certainly would encourage people to reach out directly to you all, and we will include your contact information and more information about your organization when we send out resources as follow-up to this webinar. But I really appreciate you sharing your story about your approach there. So it looks like we've got Anika back with us now, which I think is fantastic. Anika, do you feel like we have time to show the video from our friends at the policy panel?
Why don't you skip that and let's have some more time for questions. I think would be a better.
So I know that I will go ahead and throw one out, which has already come in via the chat feed. Do you have something else, Bill?
I just wanted to make one kind of concluding point though before you move over to that, which is, from our perspective, the communication strategy is weird and awesome. It really starts at a foundational level, though, of building a constituency base of people affected who can speak in their own voice, tell their own stories, and have that kind of authentic participation in creating the solutions that they need. It's their lives, it's their community. Then the communication side really takes a strong hold is that in Arkansas, we only 15% African American, 5% Latino, 80% white. You can't win a campaign here with just a constituency base of communities of color, and so you have to bring in allies. And so you have to find communication tools that help build that common language and common analysis and bring in those white allies and make connections to communities of color in a way that's respectful to the leadership coming out of those communities. And that's where I think that that's all these communities connect. And I think we're going to lose Bernadette, so I appreciate her joining us.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you so much. So our one question I'll throw out, then which has already come through on our chat feed, is for Jessica. So Jessica, if you could unmute yourself, we have a question from, I think, Manuela Coo. I don't know, I know you, Manuel. Nice to meet you. Thank you for submitting a question, which is a question about how did you specifically sort of test for implicit bias in your survey? You mentioned that you did that, but he's asking, can you just say a bit more on how did you do that?
Sure. So I'm assuming it's not like technical question about how you embedded it into the actual survey, which I can't really answer because our consultancy firm did it. So they did some magic. But we use the, there's two popular ones. There's the implicit association test, and then there's the affect misattribution procedure created by Dr. Keith Payne. And so that's the test that we use. It's also called AMP. And it just measures people's affect towards characters that they don't know. And we flash like a very small amount of time, like 2 milliseconds, like black faces and white faces, and then people evaluate a character, and that's how you measure people's potential implicit bias. Great question.
Great. So I see another question that's popped up from Benjamin Chambers asking about wanting to connect this to the research Public Works has done over time about how we talk about government. And so thank you, Benjamin. Yes, we've got lots of resources on our website and do periodic webinars where we share the research we've commissioned. But of course, we were focusing today on related research being done that we thought our partners would particularly find a lot of use from CSI. But certainly we have done an ambitious couple of rounds of research on how do we communicate with Americans about government and the need for public solutions. There are a lot of connections between what we found and what you can see from CSI's work about sort of telling a bigger story, opening up with values that connect with people. We've talked a lot in our own work about sort of making the connection about inclusiveness and how everybody's in this together and everybody's impacted. We certainly have talked a lot in our recommendations over the years about the need to also always include solutions as a way to get people to see that this is really possible. So there's certainly a lot of overlap between the research we've commissioned at Public Works over time. And I think I mentioned earlier when I was introducing Rich that we've got another ambitious round of research going on now. We look forward to sharing all of that with you, next year. It's in the works at the moment, so I couldn't really say much more about it this time, but certainly we will get that back out to you. So thank you for mentioning that, Benjamin. Yes, we certainly still are building out our set of resources that are very much related to the conversation we're having today. Anika, do you notice any other questions that have come through? Or Bill, did you have something to offer?
Yeah, there were some questions.
Okay. Bill?
I was just going to say, building on what you were saying with you all's research, it's not hard to win the case in the public that things are bad. And in a lot of the communities where we work, frankly, people don't expect anything from government. They expect, if anything, a hard time. And so really having those solutions and building a track record, I mean, it's one of the ways we've been able to make progress over years is we've helped communities win things over time. And as they start to win things, they become more ambitious about what's possible. But I think that aspect of your communications, that it's not good enough to simply criticize what government's doing, because you're really, in a lot of ways, playing into the opposition when you do that. You also have to talk about solutions and what government can be doing at the same time. And it's complicated, but it's absolutely essential. It's not hard to go out and get people depressed about government.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
We have a question from Catherine at Catalyst. She's asking the folks in Arkansas if the stories about racism in the communities have been publicized, that these stories are really powerful, and just wondering if other people in the community have heard about these stories.
That's part of the challenge is getting folks comfortable to share those stories. So in a lot of cases, a lot of this is invisible. And that's part of the whole strategy that we're doing. The Center for Social Inclusion came in last year with us and did some work with our leadership about institutional racism or this year, I guess, and trying to frame all of and just kind of build that common analysis about these things aren't happening as one-off experiences, that teachers not being that way or that cops not being that way because they're a jerk, they're being that way because they're part of a system that encourages that kind of behavior. And building that common analysis is for us is a big first step. But then we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes to try to figure out sort of a safe way for folks to share those stories and feel comfortable with it. Because really, for us, we feel like exposing those stories, those are really powerful stories, and they're really authentic, true stories. And so finding a way to bring that to light is one of the center pins to the strategy, and we're working on it, but it's not easy. Jessica, I don't know if you've been to Arkansas a couple of times. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the things you've heard or seen, but I mean, you've heard people share some of these stories with you too, and say, but I'm not going out and saying that publicly.
Yeah, I agree. It's just the fear of like backlash, and the difficulty of reaching from just within local Arkansas news to like national news, and that kind of barrier in terms of how comfortable people are and where that reaches.
I think another example I meant to give is people are also really afraid of this being turned around back on them, because a lot of this is really subtle, sort of sideways things. And I'll give you another example. In most of the communities where we work on education issues is one of the issues that we work on. And so one of our leaders would call the school and ask for a copy of the school report card, which by law is supposed to be available to anybody who wants it. It's FOIable document. It's supposed to be in the school library. So a local leader calls, asks for the school report card. No, you can't have it. We hire organizers from local communities who in a lot of cases are African American. So we'll have that organizer call the school. A lot of times they have relationships with people at the school and ask for the report card. No, you can't have it. So then Bernadette, who is a former school board member, and you just saw her, she's not shy. She calls and asks for it, and they tell her no. And so then I call and I ask for it, and I sound white, or our white lobbyist calls and asks for it. We have it in 5 minutes. Yes, sir. We'll be right over. And so then for one of our leaders to go back and say, well, that was racism, they say, no. Sally just didn't ask for it the right way, and Bill asked for it in the right way, and it gets really difficult to prove. And our leaders are afraid of, if they make a claim, of racism, it's too easy to dismiss. It's too easy to say, well, they misunderstood. And they end up getting, you've seen this on Fox News 1,000 times, where the African American person gets accused of being the racist for raising race. And so again, that's caused our leadership to be shy about how to tackle these issues. It's insidious.
Thank you, Bill, for that. So we're getting so many questions, which is exciting. But I know we're at time, so I want to ask Jessica and Bill and Rich if you have a few more minutes that you can stay on. If not, we could make sure that these questions get answered through the email. But if you have a few more minutes, Jessica, Bill, and Rich. Jessica, yes, you have a few more minutes. Bill, can you stay on a few more minutes? Okay. And Rich, I don't see you, but if you are here and have any thoughts, we have a few more questions. And we understand if you all need to log off, but we'll have the recording where you can hear how the questions were answered. So the next one that
we're also able to collect the questions that are coming through in the chat. So if there are any that we don't get to, we'll try to email you and start a dialogue with you that way. So appreciate everybody.
Thank you, Elaine.
We have more questions than answers ourselves, so.
And we know we have a great group of participants who also have who may have answers and insights to these questions as well. So if you have anything to share via the chat box, that would be also appreciated. The next question we have is, are there any resources that the panelists know of that focus on training immigrant populations on how to engage with local government towards public policy change? And before I hand it over to anyone, I do want to note that the New American Leaders Project is a national organization that trains new American leaders and immigrant populations on how to run for office. And I think with that are a lot of training tools on how to engage with government as well, if you choose not to run yourself. But it's an amazing organization, and that's one resource.
Two groups in Arkansas that have done a great job of that are the Arkansas United Community Coalition, and I could ask them if they have some tools and share. And then the Hispanic Women's Organization of Arkansas is another that's done a lot of great training around civic participation and rights. We've done some of that work, and one of the barriers that we've had, particularly with the undocumented community, is fear of reprisal, and then also just cultural differences of having different expectations of government. And so those are some of the barriers, but there's certainly effective tools that those two organizations are using in Arkansas anyway.
Jessica, Rich, did you have anything else to add to that question? Okay, so the next one we have is, to what extent do you feel, this is from Francine Richards, to what extent do you feel the messaging can be or needs to be altered for elected officials as opposed to the general public? This question can be for any of the panelists, but in Arkansas, given the political makeup of the legislature, it seems particularly important. Thank you, Francine.
Rich, why don't you tackle that?
Yeah, I think especially with some of the more conservative lawmakers, talking more about making government more efficient and more effective. And so I think there are ways to bring that in. Talking more about the economy, I think resonates with some of them. Issues like fairness, and equity. If you use those terms just on their own, I mean, those terms tend not to resonate with a lot of those folks.
And from my perspective, it's really about mobilizing the constituency bases of those lawmakers and figuring out how to communicate to them. Most of the lawmakers that I know, they're just not interested in these issues at all. If anything, they're interested in them from the wrong direction. But so it's really figuring out how to communicate to the voters in those districts to put pressure on those lawmakers.
I will say I think one other thing to add here is that when you're working particularly with lawmakers that are open to conversations with you and thinking through the issues or are already supporters, the way we talk to them is we're also modeling for them effective ways to communicate. And that's how they will then speak to the press or speak in their own newsletters. And to the extent that we are grounding our own, how we're communicating with them, or when we can, and when we're not sort of dealing with some people on the sort of maybe far on extreme, the way Rich was talking about, when you're dealing with everybody else, it's also an opportunity to model for them, and you're also giving them the kind of language that you then ideally want them to use. So attempting to, trying to ground that language in kind of the best research framing messaging that you can, I think is worth thinking through, being important, even if it's a one-on-one conversation with them, because they will then turn around and that's how they'll be then communicating about that issue.
And I just wanted to add, so we just joined a joint project with the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, and they are a network of cohorts of local jurisdictions across the nation, and name some few like California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Virginia, and folks are within government are asking for an institutional change, so changing internal policies that are more racially equitable, and it's been really great, really successful. But of course, there's a lot of barriers in people understanding how it could be successful across different types of jurisdictions. But there are definitely ways, and that's a resource also that if people wanted to check that out, it's the Government Alliance for Racial Equity.
And we will include that link, Jessica, in the follow-up email. And we also had a question for the video that was going to be shown. We'll send the link to that video as well so that you can see that that Bill shared. So I think that we've got all those questions covered. If more come up, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, you can reply directly to the email invite. I want to thank again our partners at the Center for Social Inclusion for highlighting their great report and how it connects to folks on the ground, and for Bill and Rich for sharing their rich stories. Rich for sharing his rich stories. Sorry, I just had to say that again. And apologize for the technical difficulties, but it seems like we did okay, and we have a recording that we will share with you. And it seems like this is a really important discussion that needs to be continued. So we will make sure that we follow up and do something again in the following year. Elaine, do you have any other closing thoughts?
Thank you to the folks who joined, and especially to our guest presenters. Public Works and in our new iteration, when we team up with Indivisible, are going to continue to dig deep and point you all towards resources and continue to make some progress towards this. The webinars always feel like you're just scratching the surface of something, and that is certainly true, but hopefully some nuggets of wisdom that come through that will be helpful. And as Anika said when we started this, our plan all along is to have a sort of reciprocal relationship where we share some wisdom, some ideas, and then people try things out and give feedback to us and real world examples and challenges, and we all feed that to our respective research teams that we contract with. So I look forward to continuing that kind of relationship, both with our guest speakers and of course with the folks who joined us today.
I just add to the audience that's listening, you all are smart and have tools as well, so you don't have to just email in questions. You can email in suggestions or tools or whatnot, and we're all building kind of a collective strategy together. So thanks for the help.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for sharing that. This is not just a one-way street. We definitely want to hear your wisdom on the questions that were asked or any other thoughts that came up, so that we can continue to learn and navigate this challenge together. All right. Have a lovely weekend, and we will be in touch.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.